welcome everybody. Great to see you all here virtually. My name's David Barnes. I'm a lecturer in English here at Trinity, and it's my pleasure to introduce Rory Fraser. Rory's book Follies came out at the end of last year, and well, he'll talk about it. It's a really, I've just read it. It's a great journey through gems, I guess, in England. Just to briefly introduce Rory, he grew up between Rutland and Inverness, worked for English Heritage, and learnt art history in both Venice and Florence before studying English here at Trinity, where he specialised in landscape poetry and architecture, and also wrote comedy for the Oxford Review. Rory's just completed an MPhil in architectural history at Cambridge, specialising in the confluences between the work of the architect John Vanbrugh and design in Mughal India. So very interesting combination of topics. Rory currently lives in London, where he divides his time between writing, lecturing, and painting commissions. Yeah, Follies came out last year, 2020. It's gaining a lot of interest, in rave reviews in the Times. It was Book of the Week from the LRB. It's being developed as a documentary. Is that right, Rory? As a documentary too. So more on that later. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rory, and he's going to introduce his book and take us through some of the ideas and introduce us to some of the buildings in Suffolk. So, Rory, over to you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I'm now going to share my screen. So, can everyone? Can I get a thumbs up if that's working? Is that functioning? Brilliant. Great. Sorry. So, I'll get my stopwatch going so I don't end up going massively over time. So yes, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. That was definitely the most generous introduction I think I've ever had. So I feel incredibly honoured by that preamble. But yes, my name is Rory. I was at Trinity between 2015 and 2018. I studied English literature here and had a wonderful time. Yes, when I was an undergrad, I got very interested in the work of Alexander Pope and his relationship with the architect William Kent. And that sort of led me on to landscape architecture, and I very fortunately got a book deal around that time, and worked on it for a bit, and it finally came out during the pandemic, which provided a good writing opportunity. So that's a sort of brief summary of the connection between the English and Follies. I think what I'll do is I'll begin with just a kind of brief sort of summary, I suppose, of what I think a folly is and why follies are important, because that's a question that invariably people ask and you get tripped up on immediately. So if I can try and clarify that, we can establish that, and then I can move on to talking about some of the more interesting entries in the book, and sort of in so doing give a kind of history of landscape architecture as well. So I think folly is an interesting concept in and of its own right, and people often ask, why do we dedicate such? Why would people bother to build follies at all? They're huge amounts of money, and they're kind of incredibly silly. And I think the simple answer to that is that folly is a very important part of sort of being human. We through light relief, we somehow right ourselves a little bit in the same way that through COVID we all lacked social contact and went slightly mad. And there are lots of different ways that this manifests itself. I mean, you have here the fool from, well, I don't think it is from King Lear, but the kind of fool you would have in King Lear that we all learned about during GCSEs, who's meant to whisper sort of nonsense and seriousness into the ear of the king. You have, the magic flute, which is ostensibly a really silly opera, but is enormous fun to watch and very, very beautiful. We have jazz from 1930s and 40s, which again, sort of seemingly pointless sort of musical melodies, but again, are a huge fun. And then today, people are addicted to TikToks, which again, I've got a little sister. I don't have TikTok myself, but my little sister shows me TikToks, and I, other than to gain a smirk, to laugh, to sort of have something to occupy yourself for a little bit, that they sort of, again, in a way, seems to be a kind of folly medium. So I think that folly kind of has many ways of expressing itself, and what we're going to be focusing on today is how folly is manifested architecturally, and some of the ways it's manifested, and why it's fun and interesting. So basically, I'll come on to this slide in a moment. When you think of a building, it tends to be a marriage of function and form. But imagine a world where form is more important than function, or even where form is the function. And this is the world of Follies. In this lecture, we're going to travel the length of England, looking at some of the most significant follies from the last 500 years. Whilst many dismiss these buildings as beautiful whims of the rich, there is a lot more to them than meets the eye. They are catalysts for architectural innovation and self-expression. They are focal points for literature, landscape, and art, and they act as magnets for stories. In other words, they are portals to the past that speak of a remarkably liberal culture in which such architectural self-expression was not just permitted, but celebrated. I want to get under the skin of this national cabinet of curiosities and understand why these small, elaborate buildings with apparently no purpose constitute some of England's most interesting architecture. Now, of course, the key question then to begin with is what exactly is a folly? Well, there is no precise science to this, but the kind of general view is that a folly is an elaborate building set in a beautiful landscape with apparently no purpose other than to improve the view. It is architecture for the sake of architecture. There's a very long quote I could use here, but I'm actually not going to, but it's basically boiled down into the notion that the folly lies in the eye of the beholder. So, and this is a useful escape clause for me, because it means that the buildings that I choose are follies in my eye, but might not be in yours. But essentially, they are in some ways deeply personal things. They are personal to the people that build them, but also to the recipient and the person who looks at them. But the first sort of folly we're going to begin with, I mean, follies are traditionally regarded as 18th century things, and by and large that's correct. The vast majority do lie within the long 18th century. But the idea goes back much, much further. I mean, you could say that the earliest follies are remnants of medieval monasteries that were destroyed during the Reformation, because they're then reincorporated into romantic gardens in the late 18th century. But I won't focus on those for now, because they aren't, purpose-built follies. They were obviously ruined. So the first time we begin to see kind of purpose-built follies is in the late 16th century, when there is sort of greater confluence and interest in what is happening in Italy. So here we have the Chateau de Chambord in France, and this is an illustration of essentially a fusing of forms. So on the one hand, you have, your traditional castle structure, which you can see on the kind of lower level with the bastions and so on, but the roofline is immensely complicated, and on it you have this variety of sort of bastardized classical forms, chimneys and so on, cupolas, and it's of course rigidly symmetrical and vaguely proportional. So this is an illustration of what's happening across Europe at the time, and England is no exception. Of course, most people couldn't afford to build things like this. And so what we tended to find was people would insert banqueting houses into their gardens because they were a sort of nod to the classical world, or certainly a nod to Italian life. And they would go to these banqueting houses for sort of sweet courses. So in England, this is an English example of the same phenomenon. This is a prodigy house. This is Willerton Hall. And again, you see the same sort of fusing of medieval and classical detail to create a sort of indigenous architectural style. And as I say, within the landscapes of these buildings, you had banqueting houses. Now, this is seen in sort of the top center of this garden. So this is a very, very formal garden, sort of pre-English garden, and people would sort of serenade out of the house and into the banqueting house, and there they would eat incredibly valuable foodstuffs, essentially. This would be kind of quince and parmesan and biscotti and all this kind of thing, and partly because they would be out of earshot from their servants, but also because it would be a place where they could slightly imagine that they were in a different world, or namely sort of somewhere not far from Florence or Rome. And there have been, there are millions and millions of examples of this across the country. One of the most fun ones is this at Schwalkston Pavilion in Derbyshire, which was subsequently used as a shooting location for a Rolling Stones album cover, because it was sort of appropriately whimsical. I think it was called The Beggar's Banquet was the album in question. But I'm not going to focus on this one. I'm going to focus instead on Rushton Triangular Lodge, which is an incredibly interesting building. Now, Rushton has a very complicated story, which I will try and proceed for us. But it is essentially, it is a banqueting house, but it's a banqueting house. It's just a banqueting house plus. It's a sort of extra banqueting house. So it was built by a man called Thomas Tresham, who was an Elizabethan. Thomas Tresham was a very interesting man because not only was he fantastically wealthy and incredibly well connected, but he was also very clever. And here is an image of him on the right, surrounded by the things which interested him. He was fascinated by books. He had a huge library, one of the most impressive architectural libraries in Europe at the time. As you can see, he's got sort of lutes and weaponry, divine symbolism. His hand rests on a skull, rather like sort of Hamlet. He was a kind of the epitome of a Renaissance man. And he was so popular that Elizabeth I knighted him in the 1570s, and he was tipped to join the Privy Council to help run the country. But unfortunately, he had there was a slight hitch, which was that he was Catholic, and unlike most of his fellow aristocrats, he doggedly refused to convert to Protestantism, despite Queen Elizabeth personally sort of beseeching him several times to do so. Now, that would have been fine were it not for the fact that a few years later he was discovered to be housing Edmund Campion in a priest hole in his house, Rushton Hall. Now, Edmund Campion, was, of course, an infamous Jesuit priest who was basically sent from Rome to convert or indeed sort of fortify the faith of England's aristocracy and anyone else who he could find. And he was discovered to be hiding in Tresham's house. They were both arrested. Campion was, I think, hung, drawn, and quartered. And Tresham was tried. And because he was so popular, he managed to get away with his life. And he sort of proclaimed his true English heart in front of the court and tried to persuade them that it was possible to be both Catholic and loyal to the sovereign. So he was quite far-thinking in that respect, but was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison. And when he was in prison, he got very bored, essentially. And people who visited his cell found it covered with chalk scribbles and scrawls, sort of lots of imagery and strange messaging, and no one could quite work out what it was, and they thought he might have gone mad. But this proved not to be the case, because when he was released from prison, it transpired that the scribbles and scrawls on the wall of his cell, were actually the designs for a folly, or a fantastically complicated banqueting house, which he then built in the grounds of his house with his remaining fortune. And this is Rushton Triangular Lodge, which is, as I say, I think probably the most, certainly one of the most fascinating buildings of the period, if not the most fascinating folly. And Rushton Triangular Lodge is notable for a number of different reasons. I mean, as with all banqueting houses of the period, it is quite classical, or has classical elements. It has this sort of, classical entablature around it. It is rigidly symmetrical. It's sort of crowned with obelisks in a slightly kind of crazy way. But there's more to it than that. I mean, obviously it is triangular, and it is triangular for two reasons. One, it's a joke. It's a pun on the fact that Tresham's nickname from his family was Tres, and therefore, it's three in Latin. But also it's meant to be the architectural manifestation of the Holy Trinity. And the building is covered in imagery which reinforces this trope. And I find this very interesting. I find this not interesting, not least because, as Dave was saying earlier, I studied a lot of Mughal buildings last year, and in much the same way that Muslim architects would use geometry to convey the mystery of God, so too was Tresham doing the same thing here in the UK, because he had to be much more subtle than his Protestant friends could. Essentially, he had to find a way of displaying his faith through numbers. So that's a sort of interesting parallel. But in terms of specific details, Each wall of this building is 33 feet long, which is the age at which Christ died. Above the door is carved the number 5555, which not only represents the term Jesus Maria Salus Mundi, where each word is 5 letters long, but if 1593, the date of Tresham's release from prison, is subtracted, it leaves 3962, which was the supposed date of creation at the time. There are also 33 letters around each entablature, which represent choice quotations from the Bible. Whilst, actually, hang on, I think I've got it, yes, this next slide. This entablature here, sort of on the flat side of the wall, whilst beneath it there are letters, and every single one of these letters forms an anagram of the hymn of praise. The numbers above the square plaques in the gables are interesting because they have in fact never been deciphered. Nobody knows what they mean. No one's been able to crack Tresham's code yet. And as you can see, the whole building is sort of littered with triangular imagery. And also this rather interesting sort of triangle here at the bottom, sort of middle of the slide, was actually Tresham's design for the building. That's how it came across to begin with. So that gives you a sense of the sort of complexity of it. But it's sort of, when you visit this building, you're left with the most incredible sense. You're sort of, you feel like you're sort of almost drowning in an imagery. You almost as though you're kind of listening to a radio frequency that's sort of humming in and out of tune, because you can't quite work out what it is, and you're left feeling very, in some ways, shaken by it. And so you sort of question, well, what was this for? What was the, other than it's being a sort of symbol of Catholicism, what would Tresham have used this for? And the answer is multiple purposes. He may well have used it as a banqueting house away from the house. It did occupy the right position in the garden plan for that to be an option. There's also some evidence to suggest he used it for covert secret masses and would have had a priest come from the house. It was technically listed as the house for a rabbit keeper on his estate, but we now know that that was basically a cunning ploy to stop the authorities from realizing that he had this sort of Catholic symbol. So the chances of a rabbit keeper actually living there is very unlikely. But in my mind, it's sort of, Rushton Triangular Lodge is even more than that. It's a sort of, it's the stone representation of a mass. It's like the kind of physical manifestation of a church service in stone, and rather like sort of later metaphysical poetry, it kind of falls on the mind of the viewer to interpret that symbolism and then almost recreate the mass in the mind of the viewer. It can be viewed as a sort of SOS throughout time for future Catholics to sort of grapple onto. The end of the sort of Rushton story is very sad, however, because Tresham's son was radicalized. He became a radical Catholic, and as such became involved in the gunpowder plot, was caught, as we all know, died in prison, and was still decapitated after that. And this is evidenced through the fact that the crests around all the windows, or many of the windows on the lodge, remain empty. And this was because Tresham had designed them so that they would be filled by future generations of Treshams, but because there weren't any, they remain blank to this day, which is a sort of somber reminder of the building's sad ending. In fact, Pevsner, who the architectural historian, wrote, and I can't quite remember the quote, but it was something along the lines of, basically, this building deserves to be viewed with respect because it is still a live sort of religious symbol. Anyway, now I'm going to move swiftly onwards to a very different world, the world that you are currently in now, Oxford, to New College, where one of the other follies in the book features, and this is a very different type of thing. It's not a building at all. It's an earthwork, and this is the Mound at New College, which again its genesis comes from the same struggle that was taking place at Rushton Triangular Lodge. You have essentially the sort of confusion as to the direction of the national religion. Are we going to be Catholic? Are we going to be Anglican? Are we going to be Puritan? And part of that then bubbles into the Civil War, which is where the Mound enters stage right. The Mound is a, for those of you who visited it, is a absolutely curious thing. It's huge. It's 60 feet wide and 30 high, and like a sort of covered in holm oaks, sort of, you know, evergreen oaks from the Aegean, which sort of makes it resemble a kind of island in the middle of the lawn. And it has this curious staircase which goes up the middle, which if you clap on at the end of it, it creates a strange noise. So it's a kind of really otherworldly spot. And people for a very long time were extremely confused as to how it came to be about. Simple answer is that it was initially designed as a sort of classical Parnassus or sort of mountain within the gardens of New College, as was sort of becoming popular again from Italy. But it was quite small to begin with. And when the Civil War struck Oxford and the king made it clear that he was going to make his capital there, the rather sort of canny warden of New College decided, who I gather was an extremely keen horticulturalist, decided that he would take advantage of this to build the biggest Parnassus ever, on which he could place a cannon, because the Parnassus was, of course, next to the city walls, and so you could get a pretty good line of fire at the enemy. So this I suppose this probably be described as the most singularly impractical contribution to the war effort from the entire Civil War, but it was basically an enormous garden sort of structure that was meant to be defensive. But so the king arrived with Henrietta Maria. It was all very exciting. He was at Christchurch, she was at Merton. Students were being drilled in the cloisters and so on and so forth, and some poor student would have to sit on the mound sort of guarding this cannon. But I don't think it was used very much because, as Robin Lane Fox puts it, given the singular speed at which an Oxford college moves, I think it was barely finished by the time that the Civil War was over. And so it sort of basically never really met its purpose. And so instead, New College was left with simply the most enormous Parnassus. And here we have a nice picture of the Siege of Oxford. So here it is. This is an illustration of the mound at New College, and you can see how it would have been used had it had a cannon on top. But one of the things I really like about this is that because it's situated within an Oxford college and because it is so vast, in some ways there's kind of Dionysian spirit which was originally intended for the mound, remains to this day, and so it has a very kind of literal function. And the mound is the subject of many pranks, I gather, from friends at New College. When they were recently excavating it, they discovered 17th century mugs, pipes, and a bottle. So we know that its purpose has remained the same until JCR events today. They also found the bones of a lamb that had asphyxiated on a Mars bar, which apparently was again the subject of some student prank involving a lamb that sort of found its way to New College. But yes, yeah, so it now serves its original function as a Parnassus, or a replica of the Greek mountain famed as home to the classical muses, and that is reinforced by the New College undergrads, who in some way could act as its nymphs. In fact, there was one moment relatively recently again when the college proposed to trim the mound's shrubbery, and this caused outcry in the London press. Because the college was accused of trying to sabotage student love lives and that sort of thing. So it really is a controversial spot. But again, I find it interesting because I say it was created as this sort of classical mountain in the garden. It had another function in the Civil War, and then it returned to that afterwards. And they're quite unusual these days. And here, here we have a nice classical sort of scene. Perhaps not that closely related to the undergrads of New College, but one can imagine it nonetheless. Anyway, moving swiftly onwards, after, of course, the Civil War, we have the restoration of the monarchy, which is very exciting. Charles II is a sort of bit of a nincompoop. His brother's even more of a nincompoop, so much so that he has to flee, as we see in this image on the right. The sort of Whig cabal decide to invite William of Orange and Mary to reign as sort of Britain's first properly constitutional monarchs. And this is really, really, really important to the world of design as well as politics. And essentially, you get a new generation of sort of, power barons, I suppose. And one of them is the third Earl of Carlisle, Charles Howard, who decides that he wants to build a house that will match his political standing, and which you can see on the bottom right of this image. And of course, it is the infamous Castle Howard. And he met his architect at the Whig Dining Club, the Kit Kat Club, that was basically established for the preservation of Protestantism, sort of proto forms of democracy, fighting off autocratic monarchs, that sort of thing. So John Vanbrugh, was also a member of this club, and somehow, and to this day, it muddles architectural historians, managed to persuade the Earl of Carlisle that he was the man to build Castle Howard, which was astonishing, given that Mr. Vanbrugh had never built anything really up until that point. He wasn't an architect, he was a playwright. And in fact, this was only one of his many different careers. He had been a soldier, he had been arrested for being a spy in Paris. He had traveled to the Mughal Empire and worked as a factor for the East India Company in Surat for a couple of years. And of course, he was this famous playwright, as English students will know, famed for basically beginning the sentimentalization of plot lines for female characters, particularly. So he was a kind of really, really, really eclectic man. But thanks to this eclecticism, his designs are absolutely incredible. They are more dynamic, more exciting, more theatrical than most of the other designs of the day. And they're also instilled with a good dollop of romance. And so again, the sort of styles that you see in the Elizabethan period, with largely medieval frameworks with classical detail applied to them, are reversed. And here you have largely classical frameworks with elements of British indigenous or English indigenous architecture applied to them. So in the case of Castle Howard and subsequent buildings, they are lending or borrowing quite a lot of details from British castle forms, elaborate roof lines, not dissimilar to Elizabethan buildings, and so on. And the gardens were no exception to this trend, this politicization of design. There were sort of two prongs to this. On the one hand, gardens were being classicized, as was the fashion at the time, to become more like the paintings of Poussin and Lorraine. So here we have on the left one of these paintings, and on the right here's Stourhead, and you can see the sort of parallels with the Pantheon in the background and the bridge on the front left, and so on and so forth. But also there was this sense that we needed a national garden style as well as a national architectural style. And we see this basically in the loosening of gardens. You know, the formal rigid garden where man was the center of everything is considered to be far too European, far too autocratic, and we need something that is more relaxed and representative of our marvelous constitution here in the United Kingdom. And so on the left, you can see an early design by Vanbrugh. This is again very sort of very kind of early 17th century. It's very sort of rigid, very formal. And on the right, another project that Vanbrugh was involved with at Stowe in Buckinghamshire, which is much more relaxed. And although it's got these massive avenues, you're beginning to see a loosening up of pathways. They're becoming more wiggly. You've got serpentine lakes, you have ha-has that don't disrupt the view. And so there's this general loosening. And as I say, this is both fashion to sort of follow classical fashions, but it's also political. And the folly is absolutely key to this, because the folly essentially acts as the safety pin in the whole process. It pins the gardens together. Whereas banqueting houses are sort of isolated works of art within the garden, the folly becomes part of a whole work of art. And as I say, acts as a sort of visual focal point for those views. Now, there are lots of different quotations I can use to support this, but I suppose I think one, maybe would I include that? I'm not sure I would include that. Horace Walpole wrote something very useful when thinking about this kind of garden, and he says that poetry, painting and gardening, or the science of landscape, will forever by men of taste be deemed three sisters. And in other words, what he's trying to do there is to reinforce this fact that this is an almost, this type of garden doesn't just rely on one medium. It's not just landscape. It's also meant to be borrowing from painting. It's meant to be borrowing from literature. It's sort of combining all of these different forms into the garden. And there is this sort of strongly literary tone to these gardens. I won't read this quotation because it's quite long, but basically in parallel with the paintings of Poussin and Lorraine, you also have these gardens simultaneously imitating poems, or rather images that are conjured up in pastoral poems of the day. And the idea was basically that when you're reading a pastoral poem, it was rather through its imagery, punctuation and flow. It was like walking through a garden, and that when walking through a garden through use of vista, planting and path, it was like reading a poem. And so again, Follies occupy this interesting place where they're not poems, obviously, but they are forms of art. They're architectural emblems within a garden that is basically being fueled by multiple art forms and political theories at the same time. Anyway, we arrive at the Temple of the Four Winds. Now, this is in the garden at Castle Howard, which is a very early sort of cusp garden in the English landscape garden movement. And I find it fascinating because it essentially is a wonderful illustration of the architect Vanbragh's various architectural influences. So on a base level, it was inspired by the Villa Rotunda, Palladio's Villa Rotunda in northern Italy, but there's a lot more to it than that. At a base level, you have this sort of stage with these statues on top, which again reminds us of Vanbragh's earlier career as an architect. Well, at the next level, it has a sort of cube, this strange, rather kind of rather plain cube at the center of the building, which again is a reminder of Vanbragh's interest in medieval and romantic architecture. He liked to create things that were a little bit heavier, a little bit more weighty than one might necessarily associate with the classical. And this can be illustrated. The kind of buildings he was thinking of are here. This is Montacute, a pavilion at Montacute House, and this is Little Bolsover Castle. And again, especially on the right, you see the same kind of cube formation that Vanbrugh was very keen on. Then you have also this roof line, this very elaborate roof line, lots of urns. And then perhaps most interestingly of all, you have the dome. Now, the dome's a really interesting one because the dome was sort of a bit of a kind of, wasn't used that frequently until this point in English architecture, or certainly in English Baroque. I mean, St. Paul's obviously being one of the major exceptions. And there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that Vanbrugh, when he was designing Castle Howard, again, he'd never designed anything before, borrowed inspiration from his Indian trip, essentially. And on the right here, we see a mausoleum from the English cemetery in Surat, where Vanbrugh worked, which was a fascinating combination of classical and Mughal forms created by the merchants in India, so that they could bury their dead in a sort of a fashion that wasn't too dissimilar to the local Muslim population. And Vanbrugh notes this, and he writes about it in a letter to, back to his, I think, his family. And when one looks at the design of, if you sort of kind of remember this mausoleum on the right, and then you look back to the design of the temple, they're actually quite similar, with these urns on the roof and the dome and the cupola and so on and so forth. And so, as I say, there is some evidence to suggest that when designing an Elysian garden in the UK, Vanbrugh was taking inspiration from the already well-established Elysian gardens in the Mughal Empire. So yes, Temple of the Four Winds is a sort of really, really, really fascinating building. But moving again on, it doesn't take too long before people begin to get bored of classicism. They begin to find endless nymphs and fauns and temples boring. It's too Disney. And so they decide to do something different. And this is sort of spearheaded by Horace Walpole, who essentially develops, well, what we today would recognize as the Gothic, or the Gothic with a K, the Strawberry Gothic. And this is, again, a sort of quite literary genre, in that he sort of forms some of its central kind of theories in his novel, The Castle of Atranto, which many regard to be one of the first, if not the first, Gothic novel. And he built a house on the outskirts of London called Strawberry Hill, which again is a really interesting architectural sort of phenomenon, in that it has classical proportions, but it is of course heavily covered in Gothic twiddles and details. And this is an illustration from the Castle of Trent, which I won't go into. And so he began to experiment with this style through folly architecture. Follies were the first way that the Gothic was really used, well, not introduced, but rather reintroduced into English design. And the one I'm going to focus on today is Broadway Tower, because although Strawberry Hill is utterly amazing, it's sort of in a way too close to London, and it loses some of its magic as a result. And Walpole actually wrote, he said that my whole time is passed in giving tickets for seeing it and hiding myself when it is seen. Take my advice and never build a charming house for yourself between London and Hampton Court. Everyone will live inside it but you. But again, he also wrote some more serious things, and Walpole essentially summarizes the Gothic in Britain by saying that one must have taste to be sensible to the beauties of Grecian architecture. One only wants passion to feel the Gothic. And again, there's this idea that there is a separation from what we've seen before at Castle Howard, the idea that you have these sort of classical, highly logical, philosophical landscapes, and then you're moving into the Gothic, which is much more about emotion and associationism than it is about the mind, or rather sort of logic. Anyway, so Broadway Tower is built on Broadway Ridge, which is a really significant point. It's the second highest point in the Cotswolds, and it was a beacon tower. It was used for basically spotting national invasions, things like the Spanish Armada that we see in this slide. And it was the brainchild of three men. You have the sixth Earl of Coventry in the middle, very glamorous man. You can see how the wigs are beginning to get shorter, which symbolizes we're getting to the second half of the 18th century. Capability Brown on the left, who was basically the sort of intellectual grandson of Vanbrugh in the gardening tradition. And the Charles Wright on the right, who designed the tower itself. Now, here it is. This is Broadway Tower, and it's very, very, very different to Temple of the Four Winds, in that it obviously is not classical, it's Gothic. You can't see the classical elements because they're actually on the interior, and the interiors are still relatively classical in their proportions, but the outside is trying to evoke a completely different set of things. And this basically, again, architects still trying to get through this knotty question of national identity. And are we Catholic Protestant? So are we Catholic Europeans who sort of like classicism, or are we stout Anglo-Saxons who like the Gothic? And this is them experimenting with the latter. In and of itself, it's an amazing building. You can see 16 counties from the top, including the spire of Worcester Cathedral on a good day. And its subsequent history was very interesting because it had a number of different uses. It was a printing press under Sir Thomas Phelps, and it was described as being a lighthouse signaling to the friends of letters that a hospitable roof exists under which all pilgrims of learning are made welcome. It then became the weekend retreat of the second wave of the Pre-Raphaelites, under Cornwall Price, who was described as the Knight of Broadway Tower. And people like Edward Burne-Jones, Rossetti, and William Morris would go and stay there frequently. They were, of course, responsible for the beginning of the arts and crafts movement, for this sort of wonderful style of painting that is sort of meant to kind of predate classicism or jump back to the world before classicism and be instilled with a greater sense of romance, really. And so again, the tower acted as a sort of a home for this and a way of fostering that community. You could almost say that the pseudo-Gothic ideas carved onto its facade a century before reached fruition in the minds and actions of its weekenders. And that wasn't the end of the tower. In World War II, it was used as a site to spot the Luftwaffe going to bomb Birmingham. And even after that, they then built a nuclear bunker underneath it in the 1960s so that they could monitor nuclear fallout from Russia. So it's interesting that ever since its inception on the hill where they would spot armadas right through to today, this spot has always been associated with a particularly heightened sense of nationalism and national identity. And I will very briefly finish with my final folly, which is a modern folly, which is once again in Oxford. And this is the Headington Shark, which was built as a protest to the bombing of Libya in the 1980s. And the idea was that the shark would evoke the feeling that you have when you're basically being hit by a drone strike, complete and utter sense of helplessness. It, needless to say, wasn't terribly popular with Oxford City Council, who tried 4 different ways of removing the shark from the roof, claiming that other people would start building their own sharks and all this sort of thing, inappropriate for a Victorian semi-detached street, and so on and so forth. However, it was interesting. It's an interesting building insofar as it was saved by a very unlikely candidate in the form of Michael Heseltine, who was then Minister for, I think, Environment. And Heseltine wrote the most incredible defense of the shark, which I think acts as a very good defense of Follies generally, and also as a conclusion for this talk. And he said this, that the contrast between the object and its setting is quite deliberate. In this sense, the work is specific to its setting, and it would read quite differently in the context of, say, the foyer to an arts centre in Gloucester Green. It is, as the council say, incongruous. It is the very same feature which appeals to so many of the shark's supporters and which has made it an urban landmark. An incongruous object can become accepted as a landmark, in some cases becoming well known, even well loved in the process. Something of this sort seems to have happened for many people to the shark. The council is understandably concerned about precedent here. The first concern is simple: proliferation with sharks and heaven knows what else crashing through the roofs all over the city. However, I cannot believe that the purpose of planning control is to enforce a boring and mediocre uniformity to the built environment. Any system of control must make some small space for the dynamic, the unexpected, and the downright quirky, or we shall all be the poorer for it. I believe that this is one case where a little vision and imagination is appropriate, and I recommend that the Headington shark be allowed to remain. And so with that, I will conclude my talk.
Thank you, Rory, for that. I think it's a really appropriate way to finish with that quote: downright dynamic, unexpected, and the downright quirky. We are recording, just to let you know, we've got 15 minutes or so for questions. So if you've got a question for Rory, do pop one in the chat. I'm going to kick off with some thoughts of my own. It was a really interesting journey just in this lecture through various kind of different types of follies. Some of the things that particularly interested me were the ways in which you talked about kind of the relationship between the folly and national identity. And one of the fascinating was the connection between Vanbrugh and Mughal architecture, which from your bio, I note is an interest that you've been pursuing later on. We'll come back to that, but my question was about the spirit of the folly today, really. I guess you took us up to the 1980s and the Headington Shark. But just wondering, do you think the spirit of the folly and folly making is alive in architectural practice today? And where do you see that? Do you see that in current architectural practice, and if so, where?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. I think there are two answers to that. The first is it depends if we're looking into the world of pastiche or not, basically. So only a year ago, there was a folly, a very famous folly built by Nicholas Coleridge in Worcestershire, which is, oops, sorry, that's my alarm, which is a sort of Jacobean, sort of strawberry Gothic folly. It was built by Quinn and Terry, you know, it's all that brigade, basically. And yeah, it's a folly in the sort of 18th century understanding of what a folly is, and they do get built every now and then by very rich people, or in National Trust gardens by way of reconstructions. However, in sort of more mainstream, yes, I mean, there are follies being built, I mean, by modern architectural practices, and they tend to be eco buildings. The idea is as landscape buildings, they, you know, should be green and part of the landscape, and often are fitted with more modern machinery and items than houses are more cutting edge green technology. But as I said at the beginning of the talk, I think, to be honest with you, I mean, yes, the idea of a sort of place where you can go away and meditate and sort of perhaps do yoga or think or write or whatever it happens to be is you know, I think as fashionable as ever. It's never really gone out of fashion. But I think if one is looking, I think that folly as a concept sort of kind of comes and goes in and out of the architectural sphere. You know, it kind of totally evaporated from architecture in the UK in the 19th century because we became so sort of Christian and serious. And then it reappeared in the 1930s, and then it sort of comes and goes. And I think we're currently in a period where it isn't particularly present. And as I say, I think a lot of kind of folly is actually being instilled or exercised in the sort of internet, the world of the internet, with things like, as I said, TikTok and stuff like that. So I don't think it's necessarily here at the moment, but I'm sure it'll come back relatively soon. So that's my answer to that question.
It will return. The folly will return. We've got a range of questions here in the chat. Sarah had a question. Do you want to ask? This question was, how did you pick which folly to do?
I'm so sorry. I'm afraid I didn't quite catch that.
So Sarah's question was, how did you pick which follies to visit and to include in the book? What was the process?
Right. Which follies? Well, that's a really good question. To be honest, the book, as you know, is as you don't if you haven't read it, but either way, is a journey from sort of the oldest folly in the UK to, or one of the oldest in the UK to one of the more recent ones. And so there were all sorts of factors that were in play. I mean, that there was the geographic factor. They couldn't be they couldn't be sort of incoherently slotted into the journey. For example, they couldn't be on Orkney Islands or something like that. They had to be relatively representative of the periods they came from. I didn't want too many huge throwbacks, too many things that were completely anomalous for the period, because then it wouldn't be a very good sort of history. But the main thing was, to be honest, the main two things: they had to be very beautiful, they had to make good watercolors, or if not, they had to have amazing stories attached to them and be really, really sort of exciting. And luckily, you know, there were an awful lot of contenders.
Great. A few more questions in the chat. So Rory, what would your folly look like if you built one?
Gosh, that's a really difficult question. And you know, I've actually never thought about it. Oh my goodness. What would my folly look like? Oh dear. Well, if I'd been 10, I would have said, you know, some enormous climbing frame with lots of cupolas and things. These days, what would my folly look like? I, to be honest with you, I've always been a fan of, I mean, I used to be very interested in English Baroque, hence why I did my master's on it. But actually, the older I get, the more interested I become in Elizabethan and sort of Stuart design. I think it's more dynamic. And I suppose if I could choose a folly, I would probably opt for something something within that remit. Perhaps more of a Tresham than I am a Vanbrugh. Anyway, something like that.
Question about, I guess, the sort of the uses of follies in the past. So if I owned a stately home, how often would I go to my folly? Would it be for parties? Would it be to get away from it, or would it be to sleep there? So I guess a question about sort of how did people actually use follies? I guess thinking about some of the examples that you put forward in this talk.
Well, to be honest with you, I think as follies are largely functionless. I mean, you can use them for pretty much anything. But different owners will have different, you know, different sort of things that they prefer. I mean, Thomas Tresham probably wasn't entertaining very much, given that he was a social outcast. The Earl of Carlisle probably was at Castle Howard. So what would they have been used? I mean, I imagine they were visited relatively frequently, or the ones I've cited certainly were quite close to the houses on the estates, meaning that they weren't too far to walk. Apart from actually Broadway Tower, which is quite a long way, but that was really built for the view, or the view onto it in many ways, rather than the view off. But you know, they get visited a lot in the summer, not much in the winter, unless it was for walks. And as I say, you know, Tresham probably went there to meditate and to think, to pray, whereas the Earl of Carlisle went there to read, to drink, to play cards, to throw dinner parties. Broadway Tower, as I say, has been used basically as a weekend retreat, place to have friends to stay, to basically do all the same things in the Temple of Four Winds. And you know, the Mound, you can't sleep in it, but it's basically been, as far as I can see, it's been used for conversation almost. It's been basically a centre point to a garden, other than what the undergrads at New College may or may not be doing there. Then you've got the Shark in Oxford, and that's, again, you can't go inside it, you can't do anything. That's quite literally a political emblem, in much the same way that, you know, the gardens, the English landscape garden was itself in its totality a political emblem. So different uses depend on different people, basically different preferences.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the talk, think about the ways in which, you know, for somebody like Vanbrugh being such a kind of polymath with all these different careers, and it seems like one of the aspects of the folly from what you've elucidated both in your book and the lecture is that the folly seems to condense a lot of things that aren't architecture. Like it creates a focal point for various things like politics or literature or other kinds of art or pleasure, hedonism or various things that kind of don't normally fit our rubric of what an architectural form is about, and that somehow these things kind of collect or act as a sort of magnet for all
absolutely.
these other.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think the reason is quite simply that in our day-to-day lives we often forget that architecture is in and of itself an art form, and so it's not surprising that it is complementary to other art forms. But we spend so much today worrying about whether it's going to drain properly, or whether we've got dry rot, or whether the college sort of plaster work's going to fall off or something. That people forget, as I say, that these things are not designed in a vacuum. Architectural styles are the result of political thinking, artistic thinking. They are designed in conjunction with the direction that other art forms are taking. So because follies don't have particularly prescribed purposes, it means I think they can be more in tune with their artistic sort of genesis.
A couple more questions from Jessica. That was absolutely wonderful and witty, touching on religion, self-expression, and national identity, amongst other things. I grew up in Bath, and so love follies. The follies you describe have a meaning behind them. And the question is, are there any pure expressions of delight, silliness, or fantasy? So anything that's sort of, just a pure expression of something that may not necessarily have a meaning or a clear sort of purpose behind it, but something that's just a pure expression of kind of fantasy or delight or silliness.
Yes. Yeah, I mean that's a very good question, and of course there are follies that do that, and I didn't include them in the book because there wasn't very much you could say other than that this is the personification of silliness. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm just trying to think of a good example, really. Delight and silliness. Yeah, I mean, there's a really interesting folly called Jack the Treacle Eater in the West Country, which no one has ever been able to work out really why it was built, what it was for, or anything. It's a sort of rubble arch with a cone on top, and then a classical statue of Mercury leaping into the sky off the top of it. They think it might have been built in the 1770s, but again, more than that, we don't know. And that's a sort of relatively good example of just pure silliness, or perhaps silliness by time, because the documentation surrounding it is gone. I'm trying to think of delight. You could argue that Russian Triangular Lodge was Tresham delighting in his faith. But yes, there definitely are examples, but they weren't so prominent in my book, as I say, because there wasn't a huge amount to say beyond that. Sorry, Dave, I think I might have slightly lost you there, or have I frozen? I can't tell what's going on. Ooh.
Was that?
Sorry, what happened there? But my internet, I think, went down suddenly.
Your internet was suddenly taken with the spirit of Follies and decided to disappear.
Yeah, my internet went rogue. So I was just going through the question in the chat was about association between the architect houses and the kinds of things that were eaten in them. So the sugar structures prepared for consumption in these kind of folly banqueting houses. I just wondered whether. So yeah, the question was about that and the connection between those things.
Sorry, I'm just re-looking at this excellent question because I want to answer it properly. Yes. I think I might have come across writings of this very master student in question. Yeah, absolutely. There was definitely connection between what was being eaten in the banqueting houses and what they looked like. They used to. I mean, I'm afraid I really don't know much about it, but sugar would be molded in marzipans and things like that into classical forms that would form the centerpieces of tables. Beyond that, I don't know much more, other than that it was a very important meal because it was unbelievably expensive, because the things that they ate were fantastically valuable. Spices were still extremely valuable, and it was a very important event. As I said, it was partly to do with getting away from your staff and having more private conversations, but it was also an illustration of your wealth, which these sugar structures illustrated, a key role. But whether architects were inspired by those structures or whether the I suppose the chefs or the sugar bakers or what were inspired by the architects, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question.
A couple more questions. Super. Thank you for a fascinating talk. The patron, Strawberry Hill and Rushton Lodge seem to bear this out. But the new college Mound, created by a college rather than an individual, feels very different. Can you shed any light on how the college came to take such a decision? Or was it very much the wish of a powerful warden? Do you know anything yet?
I do actually know quite a lot about this. I got down a real rabbit hole when looking at the Mound at New College. The answer is yes, it was basically the result of one, the head warden, top honcho, who decided that he had this opportunity to basically build this enormous garden structure and the resources to do so. It was sort of completely despotic. You wouldn't get away with it these days. But great fun, but that's partly why it took so long, and it was actually completed basically once Charles II for Charles I had his head cut off, so it was completely useless. But an interesting little exercise in tyranny. So I mean, to be more serious, I think it was the initial decision of the governing body that they wanted to have, a fashionable earthwork in the garden, which wasn't going to be too much work. And then when the Civil War came, the warden decided to enlarge this earthwork so that a cannon could be placed on top. And then, of course, when the Civil War ended, they decided rather than dismantling it, they just keep it, which is why it's the preposterous size it is today. So yeah, emergency powers taken by a head of a college in order to create a large garden object.
I mean, the other interesting thing about this is sort of the way in which different people with different agendas maybe can kind of come together for different reasons and create kind of Follies. Stefano's got a question. Thank you, Rory, for a great talk. Were Follies sometimes built in the form of ruins? And if so, what do you make of those?
Well, absolutely, Stefano, completely. And if I had more time, I would have gone into them. I mean, that stems from the tradition that we see at Broadway Tower. So, the Gothic tower is not far removed from the Gothic ruin. And as time went on, they would become more and more ruined, as sort of part of the kind of the picturesque movement, which was the sort of matured classical garden. And ruins became so popular to the extent that they started to build pre-made ruins rather than finding ruins and knocking them down. So absolutely, that was still part of the sort of the Gothic tradition. Although I did actually have a friend who did an MPhil on Whig or sort of kind of early liberal architectural forms, and the ruin is a really interesting trope in it insofar as it entirely relies on associationism. So the ruin, for example, could represent the ruin of a different political. It could represent the ruin of, say, the Tory party. It could say represent the ruin of the Anglo-Saxons. It could say represent the ruin of Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745. I mean, ruins were used all the time, but for different purposes, depending on the personal inclination of whoever designed it or the landowner. And they're often used in conjunction with classical designs. Not at the beginning of the process, not in the kind of Vanbrugh zone, but a bit later on in the sort of from the 1740s onwards. So ruins are a really interesting thing. But again, there weren't many of my books because they weren't that photogenic, really. And so I didn't particularly want to paint them. But there are, yes, you're absolutely right. So thank you for asking. They're a very important part of the Folly journey.
Thank you so much, Rory. I think we're out of time, but it's been really fascinating to hear more insights into the book. Do all of you, if you can, look out the book, Follies. It's a great read, and it might be something you might take with you on a journey, on your own journey around around the various follies in England. But thanks again so much, Rory, for sharing your time, and thank you for this amazing lecture, and I really enjoyed the book.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's been enormous fun.